I'm writing this because I don't really know what else to do with the memories. Not because I think writing will fix anything. It won't. And not because I need people to tell me what happened. I know what happened now, at least the broad outlines of it. But there are parts of the last few years that I keep replaying, trying to understand how something can change so much without looking different from the outside. When people hear about infidelity, they usually imagine a relationship that was already broken. Constant fighting, obvious distance, some dramatic warning signs that everyone ignored. That wasn't us. Or at least it didn't feel like us. My wife and I were married for 12 years. We met in our 20s, married in our early 30s, bought a modest house in a neighborhood that wasn't particularly nice or particularly bad, and settled into the kind of life that most people probably forget about because there's nothing remarkable to say. I worked in project management for a manufacturing company. She worked in administration for a healthcare organization. Neither of us loved our jobs, but we didn't hate them either. Our lives revolved around routines. Weekdays started at 6:15. My alarm usually went off first. I'd shower while she stayed in bed for another 15 minutes. By the time I came downstairs, she'd be making coffee. Not because we consciously divided responsibilities that way. It just evolved over time. I packed lunches. She made coffee. I handled most of the yard work. She remembered birthdays. There was comfort in knowing who would do what without discussing it. Every Thursday night we ordered takeout from the same local place. Every Sunday morning we went grocery shopping together. We'd argue mildly about brands of cereal and then forget the conversation 10 minutes later. We watched television together most evenings. Not even the same shows. Half the time we were both scrolling through our phones while something played in the background. But we sat on the same couch. And somehow that counted. Maybe that sounds depressing. At the time it didn't. It felt stable. A lot of marriage isn't excitement. It's familiarity. It's knowing that somebody will remind you where you left your keys because they've watched you lose them in the same places for 10 years. It's knowing how they take their coffee. It's hearing their footsteps in another room and not needing to think about who it is. There was affection. Just quieter than when we were younger. We still texted during work. Mostly practical things. Do we need milk? Can you pick up detergent? The dog threw up again. Nothing anyone would write a movie about. But I thought those small exchanges mattered. Maybe they did. The truth is that when you've been with someone long enough, you stop evaluating the relationship constantly. You stop asking yourself if you're happy every day. You just live inside it. I knew her habits better than my own sometimes. I knew which side of the bed she drifted toward during the night. I knew she always forgot to charge her phone. I knew she would leave cabinet doors slightly open and never notice. Those details felt permanent, like furniture, like walls. Not because I thought our marriage was perfect. It wasn't. We got tired. We had periods where work consumed too much attention. Sometimes we'd go a week having mostly logistical conversations. Sometimes we'd sit through dinner with very little to say. But I thought that was normal. Honestly, I still think it is. Long-term relationships aren't constant emotional intimacy. At least ours wasn't. They're repetition, maintenance, shared responsibility, the accumulation of ordinary days. If there were problems back then, they blended into the background noise of adulthood. A stressful month at work, an aging parent, unexpected expenses, the thousand small concerns that absorb energy without announcing themselves. Nothing stood out. Nothing seemed urgent. And that's why I keep coming back to now. Because when I look back at photographs from those years, I don't see warning signs. I see vacations, birthday dinners, home improvement projects, a couple standing together at weddings, two people who looked comfortable beside each other. And maybe we were. Maybe both things can be true at once. Maybe a life can be real while it's quietly changing underneath. At the time, if someone had asked me whether I trusted my wife, I wouldn't have hesitated. Not for a second. The question would have seemed strange, almost irrelevant. Trust wasn't something I actively felt. It was simply there, like the house, like the routines, like Thursday takeout and Sunday groceries, like all the ordinary things that become invisible because you assume they'll still be there tomorrow. And if there was a moment when that certainty first began to weaken, I didn't recognize it when it happened. Not then. Only much later. Only after I started remembering certain conversations differently. If I had noticed a clear change, I think I would remember it. That's one of the frustrating things about looking back now. There wasn't a specific day when something shifted. No dramatic argument. No shocking discovery. No obvious before and after moment. Instead, it felt like the way seasons change. You don't wake up one morning and realize summer is gone. You just notice one day that it's getting dark earlier than it used to. The first thing I remember is conversation becoming slightly thinner. Not absent, not hostile, just thinner. We still talked every day. We still discussed work, errands, family updates, plans for the weekend, but there was less underneath those conversations. At least that's how it feels now. At the time, I couldn't have explained it. If someone had asked me how my marriage was doing, I would have said fine without hesitation. Because it was fine, mostly, or close enough that the difference didn't seem important. My wife started coming home a little later from work. Not dramatically later. 20 minutes here, 4 to 5 minutes there, occasionally an hour. Healthcare administration always seemed stressful to me. There were staffing shortages, scheduling problems, constant organizational changes. Whenever she mentioned staying late, I accepted the explanation automatically. Why wouldn't I? I stayed late sometimes too. That's adulthood. People get busy. The strange thing is that I can't remember ever consciously questioning any of it. Not once. What I remember instead is small moments that seemed meaningless individually. I'd ask how her day was. She'd say, long. Then she'd move on. I'd ask what happened. She'd shrug. Just work stuff. That wasn't unusual by itself. Everyone gets tired of talking about work, but over time those conversations became more common. Less detail, shorter answers, more exhaustion. At least what appeared to be exhaustion. There was also a gradual disappearance of things we used to do without thinking. For years, we'd sit together after dinner, not every night, but often. She'd read something on her phone and tell me about it. I'd complain about a project at work. We'd discuss whatever television show we happened to be watching. Nothing important, just companionship. Then those moments started happening less frequently. She spent more time upstairs, sometimes reading, sometimes watching videos, sometimes answering emails. Or at least that's what I assumed. Again, there wasn't anything suspicious about it. People need space. People change. The longer you're married, the less every hour has to be shared. That's what I told myself. And honestly, I still think that's true. The problem wasn't any single behavior. The problem was accumulation. But accumulation is almost impossible to recognize while it's happening. A friend of mine once described relationship decline as death by 1,000 paper cuts. At the time I thought that sounded dramatic. Now I understand what he meant. Not because of pain, because of scale. Each cut is too small to matter. Only later do you realize how many there were. One evening stands out in my memory. Not because anything happened, because nothing happened. I came home after a particularly frustrating day at work. A project had gone wrong. A client was angry. I was exhausted. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while she made dinner. I started telling her about it. Halfway through the story, I realized she wasn't really listening. She wasn't being rude. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was physically present, but her attention felt elsewhere. When I stopped talking, there was a pause. Then she asked a question that revealed she had missed most of what I'd said. I remember feeling slightly disappointed, not hurt, just disappointed. The kind of disappointment you forget about 10 minutes later. Or think you do. Now, I remember that moment clearly. Not because it proved anything, because it felt unusual. We all had distracted days, but afterward I found myself noticing other small instances. Conversations ending faster, topics abandoned sooner, a slight absence of curiosity. Nothing dramatic enough to discuss, nothing concrete enough to confront, just tiny reductions in engagement, like a radio station gradually losing signal. I also started noticing that she laughed less at things that used to make her laugh. Not because she seemed unhappy. That's the strange part. She didn't seem unhappy. If anything, she seemed preoccupied, occupied by thoughts that weren't available to me. At the time, I interpreted that as stress, work stress, family stress, life stress. Take your pick. By your 40s, everyone carries something. I certainly did. There were weeks when I barely felt present myself. So who was I to judge? One night I mentioned that we hadn't watched our usual Thursday show in several weeks. She looked surprised. Then she said she hadn't noticed. I remember smiling and saying something like, "I guess we're getting old." She laughed. We moved on. But later, lying awake, I found myself thinking about that conversation. Not because of what she said, because of how easily something we had done for years had disappeared without either of us discussing it. Or maybe without me discussing it. Maybe she'd already noticed. Maybe she'd noticed long before I did. I don't know. That's one of the things that makes memory difficult now. You keep returning to ordinary moments and wondering whether they meant what they seemed to mean, or whether meaning was only added afterward. At the time, though, I wasn't suspicious. Not even close. Mostly, I was tired. Work was busy. Life was busy. Marriage felt different than it used to, but different isn't the same thing as wrong. Every long-term relationship changes. Every couple drifts and reconnects. At least that's what I believed. And because I believed that, I kept explaining everything through that lens. The later evenings, the shorter conversations, the disappearing routines, the growing sense that we were sharing a house more easily than we were sharing ourselves. I thought we were moving through a rough patch that neither of us had bothered to name. I never considered there might be another explanation. Not yet. The first time a specific detail truly stayed with me wasn't because it seemed suspicious. It was because it seemed oddly forgettable. A name came up during dinner, just once, in a completely ordinary context. And then it appeared again a few weeks later. The name itself meant nothing to me at the time. That only changed when I started hearing it more often. The name was Daniel, or maybe that's not his real name anymore in my memory. After enough time passes, details start blending together. But there was a name, and for the sake of telling this story, I'll call him Daniel. The first time I heard it, it barely registered. My wife mentioned someone from work during dinner. Something about a scheduling issue. A meeting that ran longer than expected. I remember nodding while eating, half focused on what she was saying and half focused on an email I'd read earlier that day. It was unusual. People talk about coworkers. Married people spend years hearing names attached to people they'll never meet. Managers, assistants, clients, people who exist only through secondhand stories. At the time, Daniel was one of those people. Nothing more. A few weeks later, his name came up again. Then again. Still not frequently enough to stand out. Just enough that I recognized it. The thing is, if you work somewhere long enough, certain names naturally appear often. People collaborate, projects overlap, teams form. So hearing the same coworker mentioned multiple times wasn't strange. What was strange, although I wouldn't identify it until much later, was the way I remembered those conversations afterward. Not the content. The feeling, as if there was always a little less information than expected. A conversation would begin somewhere in the middle. A story would end before reaching a conclusion. Details seemed missing, though I couldn't have explained which ones. At the time, I assumed I simply wasn't paying enough attention. That's an important part of this. I blamed myself for most of the uncertainty. Memory is unreliable even under normal circumstances. When you're busy and distracted, it's easy to forget things. Maybe she'd already explained something and I'd forgotten. Maybe I wasn't listening carefully. Maybe I was reconstructing events incorrectly afterward. Those explanations felt more reasonable than suspicion. One Friday evening, she came home later than expected. Not dramatically late. About 90 minutes. She apologized and said there had been an issue at work. Someone called in sick. Schedules had to be rearranged. I believed her immediately. The explanation made sense. Healthcare facilities deal with staffing problems constantly. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but 2 or 3 weeks later, I found myself remembering it for an unexpected reason. Not because it seemed dishonest, because I couldn't remember whether she'd told me about the staffing issue before or after she got home. I know that sounds ridiculous. It probably is, but that's how uncertainty begins sometimes. Not with evidence, with confusion. I couldn't reconstruct the timeline. Had she texted me? Had she called? Had I simply assumed she'd be late because she mentioned a difficult day that morning? I genuinely didn't know. The memory felt incomplete. At the time, I interpreted that as my own forgetfulness. Now I'm less certain. Another thing started happening. Very occasionally, she'd answer questions in ways that didn't quite align with previous conversations. Nothing major, the kind of inconsistency most people would never notice. I'd ask how a project at work was progressing. She'd describe it one way. Several weeks later, the same topic would come up and certain details seemed slightly different. Different people involved, different timeline, different explanation. Again, there were innocent reasons for this. Projects change, memories change, people misspeak. I certainly do. So I never challenged any of it. Honestly, challenge isn't even the right word. I never investigated it mentally. The inconsistencies would register for a few seconds and then disappear. Life continued. Bills needed paying. The lawn needed mowing. My father developed a minor health issue that consumed several weeks of attention. There was always something more immediate than vague feelings. Looking back, what stands out isn't suspicion, it's hesitation. Every time something felt slightly off, I immediately generated explanations that made it feel normal again. Because normal was easier. Normal protected everything. A stable marriage, a predictable future, a house full of shared history. You don't abandon those things because of a confusing conversation. At least I didn't. There was also a practical reason. I was afraid of becoming the kind of person who sees problems everywhere. I've known people who spiral into suspicion, who interpret every delay, every forgotten detail, every schedule change as evidence of something. I never wanted to be that person, so whenever uncertainty appeared, I pushed back against it. Oh, maybe too hard. One memory keeps returning to me. It happened during a family gathering. Nothing significant. A birthday dinner for one of her relatives. A crowded restaurant. Lots of conversation. Lots of background noise. At some point, someone asked about work. My wife mentioned a recent project. Then she referenced Daniel. The name felt familiar by then. Not important. Just familiar. What I remember is that another relative jokingly said something like, "Sounds like you spend more time with him than your husband." Everyone laughed, including me, including her, especially her. The joke lasted maybe 3 seconds. Nobody thought anything of it. Why would they? I certainly didn't. But afterward, driving home, I noticed she brought him up again while talking about work. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I became aware that I had heard his name a lot recently. Not enough to be alarming, just enough to notice. The awareness lasted perhaps a minute. Then it faded. Life resumed. A month later, though, I found myself realizing I knew more about this coworker than I knew about several people she had worked with for years. That observation bothered me slightly, not because it implied anything, because I couldn't determine whether it was actually true. Memory had started becoming slippery. I couldn't tell whether Daniel was appearing more frequently or whether I was simply noticing him more. And once you start questioning your own perception, everything becomes harder to evaluate. You stop trusting your conclusions. You begin reviewing conversations repeatedly, not obsessively, just enough to create doubt. I didn't know it then, but that was probably the point where something changed inside me. Not trust. Trust was still intact, but certainty had developed a hairline crack, small enough that I ignored it. Small enough that most people probably would. The problem with hairline cracks is that they're invisible until pressure reveals them. And pressure was beginning to build. Not through discoveries, not through evidence, just through accumulation. A growing collection of details that didn't seem connected yet. A name, a few inconsistent timelines, conversations that felt unfinished, and a strange sense that I was slowly losing track of his story while still living inside it. At the time, I couldn't have explained why that feeling stayed with me. I only knew that for the first time in 12 years of marriage, I occasionally found myself replaying ordinary conversations after they ended, trying to remember exactly what had been said, and wondering why I suddenly felt the need to. The next thing that unsettled me wasn't a lie or a discovery. It was realizing how difficult it had become to trust my own memory of events that had happened only a few weeks earlier. For a while, nothing happened. Or at least nothing happened that I could point to. That's another thing I've learned from all of this. Sometimes the most significant periods aren't defined by events. They're defined by the slow accumulation of observations that don't yet fit together. Life continued. Work remained busy. The house needed constant maintenance. My wife and I still ate dinner together most nights. We still discussed practical things. Schedules. Those family plans. The structure of our marriage remained intact. If someone had looked at us from the outside, they probably would have seen a perfectly ordinary couple. Maybe slightly tired, maybe slightly disconnected, but hardly unusual. The difference was that I had started paying attention. Not intentionally, more like a background process running somewhere in my mind. Small details that previously would have passed unnoticed now lingered a little longer. I found myself remembering conversations after they ended, reconstructing timelines, trying to place events in order, not because I thought I was catching someone in a lie, because I felt increasingly uncertain about my own understanding of things. One example comes to mind. My wife mentioned a work dinner. Again, nothing unusual. Her department occasionally organized after-hours events, team-building exercises, retirement celebrations, end-of-quarter gatherings. Most people have some version of these. She told me about it several days in advance. The evening arrived. She attended. She came home later than expected. Not dramatically later, just enough that I noticed. When she walked through the door, she looked tired. I asked how it went. She gave a brief summary. A few people stayed longer. Conversation dragged on. Traffic was bad. End of story. At least that's what I thought. A couple weeks later, the same event came up indirectly during another conversation. And suddenly certain details seemed different. Not contradictory, just different. The restaurant wasn't the one I remembered hearing about. The number of people attending seemed smaller. The timeline felt slightly altered. The changes were tiny, embarrassingly tiny. The kind of thing that could easily be explained by miscommunication, or faulty memory, or nothing at all. But I remember sitting in the living room afterward trying to determine whether the inconsistency belonged to her memory or mine. I couldn't decide. That became a recurring theme. The more attention I paid, the less confident I became. I expected observation to create clarity. Instead, it created ambiguity, because every potential inconsistency came with alternative explanations. Reasonable explanations, normal explanations, human explanations, and I preferred those explanations. I wanted those explanations. There was also something else happening that I struggled to articulate. The emotional distance I'd noticed months earlier had become easier to feel but harder to discuss. It's surprisingly difficult to describe emotional absence. You can point to an argument, you can point to a broken promise, but how do you point to a gradual reduction in connection? How do you explain that someone still talks to you, still sits beside you, still shares a life with you, yet somehow feels farther away? I couldn't, so I said nothing. One Saturday morning we were grocery shopping, a routine we'd maintained for years. I remember standing in the cereal aisle while she looked at something on her phone. For a brief moment she smiled, not a dramatic smile, just a quick, genuine reaction to something she had read. Then she locked the screen. The expression disappeared. The moment lasted maybe 2 seconds. What stayed with me wasn't the smile itself. It was the realization that I hadn't seen that particular expression directed at me in a long time. That thought felt unfair immediately. Marriage changes. People change. Nobody remains exactly the same after a decade together. Still, the observation stayed with me, not as evidence, as discomfort. The same thing happened with texting. We still communicated throughout the day, but the nature of those messages had shifted. More logistics, less conversation, more information exchange, less connection. Again, entirely normal on paper, probably familiar to millions of married couples. The problem wasn't any individual change. The problem was the growing number of them, each one insignificant, together more difficult to ignore. Around this time, I mentioned some of my concerns to a friend. Not concerns about infidelity. I wasn't there yet. I don't think the word had even entered my mind seriously. Instead, I described the emotional distance, the sense that my wife seemed increasingly preoccupied, less engaged, harder to reach. We were having coffee after work. I remember feeling almost embarrassed discussing it, as though I was complaining about something too vague to justify mentioning. He listened for a while, then he shrugged. Sounds like marriage. That was his answer. Not dismissive, just practical. People get comfortable. People drift. People get busy. You have to make effort. Schedule time together. Talk more. The usual advice. The kind that appears in every relationship article ever written. And honestly, it seemed reasonable. Maybe he was right. Maybe that was all it was. For several weeks afterward, I actively tried to reconnect. Nothing dramatic, just small things. Suggesting we go out for dinner, asking more questions about her day, trying to recreate routines that had gradually disappeared. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. What bothered me was how often she seemed distracted even during those moments. Not unhappy, not annoyed, distracted, as though part of her attention remained elsewhere. One evening, while watching television together, I asked a simple question about something she'd mentioned earlier in the week. A project at work. Her response came a second too late. Not because she was hiding anything. At least I didn't think so. It felt more like she needed time to remember which version of the conversation I was referring to. The pause was brief, maybe 2 seconds. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. I noticed because I'd started noticing everything, or at least everything that felt slightly unusual. The dangerous thing about pattern recognition is that once it begins, you can't easily stop it. The mind naturally searches for connections. Sometimes it finds real ones. Sometimes it invents them. I was deeply afraid of inventing them. So every observation came paired with self-doubt. Maybe you're imagining this. Maybe you're looking too closely. Maybe you're creating a problem that doesn't exist. Those thoughts accompanied every moment of uncertainty. And because of that, I continued doing what I'd always done. Going to work, coming home, living our life, acting as though everything remained fundamentally unchanged. But privately, something had shifted. Not certainty, not suspicion, something quieter. I had started noticing patterns. The problem was that I still couldn't tell whether the patterns existed in reality or only in my interpretation of it. And once that question enters your mind, ordinary conversations begin to feel different, especially when you start remembering them long after everyone else has forgotten them. Looking back, there was one conversation from that period that seemed completely normal at the time. Months later, it would become one of the memories I returned to most often, not because of what was said, but because of what suddenly seemed missing from it. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. At least I think it was a Tuesday. That's part of the problem. When you're living through ordinary life, you don't catalog events carefully. You don't preserve exact dates. You don't know which conversations will matter later. Most days blend together. Work, dinner, television. Oh wait, repeat. The only reason I remember this particular evening at all is because months later I found myself replaying it repeatedly, trying to understand why it suddenly felt different. At the time, though, it was completely unremarkable. My wife and I were cleaning up after dinner. I was loading the dishwasher. She was wiping down the counters. One of those domestic moments that happen thousands of times over the course of marriage. We were talking about schedules for the upcoming weekend, errands, family obligations, the usual logistical discussion. At some point she mentioned that she might need to stop by the office briefly on Saturday. Not unusual. She'd done that before. Administrative work occasionally spilled over into weekends. I remember asking whether anyone else would be there, not because I was suspicious, because I was making conversation. Her answer came quickly. Probably a few people. Then the conversation moved on. That was it. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable. Or so I thought. Months later, after everything else, I would realize something strange. I couldn't remember her ever specifying who those people were. Not once. And suddenly, that absence felt significant. But was it actually significant? Or was I rewriting the memory after the fact? That question became increasingly difficult to answer. The more uncertainty entered my life, the less confidence I had in my own recollections. Memory isn't a recording, it's reconstruction. Every time you revisit an event, you rebuild it from fragments. And once you know the ending of a story, it's almost impossible not to reinterpret everything that came before. I spent a lot of time wrestling with that. Maybe too much. There were evenings when I sit alone in the living room after my wife went upstairs and find myself reviewing conversations from weeks earlier. Not obsessively. Not yet. Just enough to notice how unreliable my recollections had become. I remembered feelings more clearly than facts. A conversation felt off. A response felt incomplete. A pause felt unusual. But when I tried to explain exactly why, the details slipped away. That uncertainty protected the marriage in a strange way. Every suspicious thought immediately encountered a practical obstacle. You don't accuse someone based on a feeling. You don't disrupt 12 years of shared life because a conversation seemed slightly strange. At least I couldn't. So, I kept moving forward. At work, at home, in every visible sense, life remained normal. Internally, though, I was becoming more cautious, more observant, less relaxed. Not toward my wife specifically, toward reality itself. I started checking my calendar more often, reviewing old messages, trying to verify my own memory. Not because I was searching for evidence, because I was increasingly aware that memory alone wasn't enough. One afternoon, I found myself scrolling through months of text messages between us. There wasn't anything remarkable there, mostly logistics, appointments, groceries, reminders, but reading them created an unexpected feeling, a timeline. For the first time, I could see how gradually our communication had changed. No dramatic break, no obvious turning point, just a slow narrowing of emotional space. Earlier messages contained little observations, jokes, random comments about our day. Later messages became increasingly functional, information exchanged efficiently, nothing more. Again, that isn't proof of anything. Plenty of healthy marriages evolved that way. Still, seeing it laid out over months unsettled me. Patterns become harder to ignore when they're visible all at once. Around this time, Daniel's name continued appearing. Not constantly, not excessively, just often enough that I recognized it immediately whenever it surfaced. A scheduling issue involving Daniel. A project involving Daniel. A meeting involving Daniel. Every individual mention sounded perfectly reasonable. The accumulation was what bothered me. Not because coworkers can't work together frequently. Of course they can, but because I had become aware of the repetition. And once awareness exists, it's difficult to return to ignorance. One evening, I casually asked how long she'd worked with him. The question seemed innocent enough, because it was. I wasn't interrogating her. I was genuinely curious. Her answer surprised me, not because of what she said, because she seemed to think about it first. Only briefly, a second or two. Then she gave an approximate timeline. The pause was tiny, probably meaningless. Yet it stayed with me. What? I honestly don't know. That's the frustrating part. Nothing I noticed was substantial. Nothing stood on its own. Every observation could be explained by coincidence, stress, distraction, forgetfulness, or my own growing tendency to overanalyze. And I knew that. I reminded myself constantly. Still, something kept drawing my attention back to the same questions. Not is she cheating? I wasn't there. Not yet. The questions were smaller, more confusing. Why do so many conversations feel incomplete now? Why can't I remember certain timelines clearly? Why does everything seem slightly harder to verify than it used to? Why do I feel uncertain even when I have no concrete reason to be uncertain? The emotional effect was exhausting, not because I was discovering anything, because I wasn't. I existed in a state of unresolved ambiguity. Too much doubt to feel comfortable, too little evidence to justify concern. That middle ground is surprisingly difficult to live in. People imagine betrayal as a sudden event, a revelation, a moment. What they don't talk about is the period before certainty. The long stretch where nothing is clear, where every interpretation feels equally plausible, where you distrust both your instincts and your skepticism. I remember lying awake one night listening to my wife sleep beside me. The room was dark. The house was quiet. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, and I found myself wondering whether relationships can change long before either person admits it. Not necessarily through infidelity, just emotionally. Gradually, silently, the thought stayed with me for days, because it felt true regardless of everything else. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped feeling fully connected to the person sleeping beside me. I didn't know why. I didn't know whether it was temporary. I didn't know whether the problem existed in her, in me, or in the space between us. I only knew that uncertainty had become a permanent companion. And uncertainty changes the way you experience ordinary life. It makes you notice details you once ignored. It makes you revisit conversations after they've ended. It makes you wonder whether the things you're remembering are real or merely reflections of fears you haven't admitted to yourself. For months, I stayed trapped in that state, until the first inconsistency appeared that wasn't entirely dependent on memory. It was still small, still explainable, but for the first time, I could point to something concrete instead of a feeling, and that made it harder to dismiss. The strange thing is that the inconsistency itself wasn't important. What mattered was how it connected to several other details I had already convinced myself were probably nothing. The inconsistency involved a receipt, not a hotel receipt, not a gift, not anything dramatic, just a receipt from a coffee shop, the kind of thing most people would throw away without thinking. I found it while cleaning out the center console of our car. We shared the car occasionally, depending on schedules. Mine was in the shop for routine maintenance that week, so I'd been using hers more than usual. I wasn't searching for anything. I was looking for a parking ticket I'd misplaced. The receipt happened to be there. At first, I barely glanced at it. Then something caught my attention. A date, a weekday afternoon, several weeks earlier. The location wasn't close to her office, not impossibly far, just far enough that it seemed unusual. I remember staring at it for a few seconds before immediately generating explanations. Maybe she'd had an appointment nearby. Maybe she'd been running an errand. Maybe she'd attended a meeting off-site. There were dozens of possibilities. I threw the receipt away, or at least I intended to. Instead, I folded it and put it in my pocket. Not because I thought it proved anything, because I thought it was odd. That's an important distinction. I wasn't collecting evidence. I was collecting questions, and questions feel less dangerous. That evening I almost mentioned it. Then I decided not to. The conversation would have sounded ridiculous. Hey, I found a coffee receipt from 6 weeks ago. What was she supposed to say to that? Neither of us would remember. So I let it go. Mostly. The problem was that it joined other things already sitting in the back of my mind. The later workdays, the changing routines, the repeated references to Daniel, the conversations that felt incomplete. None of those things meant anything independently. Together they created a vague sense of imbalance. Not enough to justify action, enough to create discomfort. A few days later, another small inconsistency appeared. This one involved timing. My wife told me she'd attended a department meeting that afternoon. Again, completely normal. But later that evening, she referenced a conversation she had during the same time period with someone outside work. The timeline wasn't impossible, just compressed, tighter than expected. I remember mentally calculating the sequence of events and thinking, maybe I'm misunderstanding something. That became my default response. Not she is lying, not something is wrong. Simply, I'm probably missing part of the picture. And honestly, that was often true. People summarize their days. They skip details. They simplify timelines. No one provides a perfectly accurate account of every hour. I certainly don't. Yet the accumulation continued. Weeks passed. More ordinary life. More uncertainty. One evening, I was working in the home office when I heard her laughing downstairs. Not unusual. People laugh. What struck me was how spontaneous it sounded. The kind of laugh that escapes before you realize it. I walked into the kitchen expecting to find her watching a video. Instead, she was looking at her phone. The screen locked almost immediately. Not abruptly, not suspiciously, just naturally. I asked what was funny. She said, something from work. Then she smiled and returned to whatever she was doing. The interaction lasted maybe 15 seconds. At the time, I accepted the answer completely. Hours later, lying in bed, I realized I couldn't remember the last time she'd shared something funny from work with me. Again, not evidence, just another observation, another addition to the growing collection. The difficult thing about ambiguous evidence is that it never settles anything. It only creates more interpretations. Every detail pointed in multiple directions. I became increasingly aware of how much effort I spent choosing the most charitable explanation. Not because I was naive, because I wanted to be fair. Marriage requires fairness. Trust requires fairness. You can't sustain a relationship while constantly assuming the worst. So I kept assuming the best, even as the assumptions became harder to maintain. Around this time, I mentioned my concerns to my brother. Not all of them, just enough. We were helping our parents move some furniture. A long afternoon filled with repetitive work. At one point, I casually brought up the emotional distance I'd been feeling. The uncertainty, the sense that something had changed. He listened quietly. Then he asked a simple question. Have you talked to her about it? I told him not really. He nodded. Then start there. That was his advice. Nothing profound, nothing insightful, just practical. The problem was that I couldn't identify what exactly I was supposed to discuss. A feeling? An atmosphere? A collection of half-formed concerns that dissolved under scrutiny? Every time I imagined the conversation, it sounded irrational. So I postponed it. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The relationship continued functioning. From the outside, probably normally. Inside, something felt increasingly fragile. Not broken. Fragile. There's a difference. One Saturday afternoon, I sat alone in the living room reviewing old calendar entries. Not because I planned to. I was trying to remember the date of a family event. While scrolling through previous months, I noticed something unexpected. Several occasions when my wife's stated work schedule and certain events didn't seem to align perfectly. Again, not impossibly, just imperfectly. A late meeting that overlapped with another commitment. An errand that didn't fit neatly into available time. A work function whose duration appeared to shift depending on when it was discussed. Each discrepancy was tiny, the sort of thing no reasonable person would build a case around. Yet seeing multiple examples together created a different effect. For the first time, I wasn't relying entirely on memory. There were records, dates, appointments, messages, not enough to prove anything, enough to challenge my confidence in the existing explanations. I remember staring at the calendar for a long time, not because I'd discovered some hidden truth, because I realized how much energy I had invested in avoiding certain conclusions. The realization frightened me, not because I believed she was having an affair, because I suddenly understood that the possibility had become real enough to occupy mental space. And once a possibility reaches that stage, it's difficult to push it back out. After that day, I started noticing my own behavior changing. I listened more carefully, remembered more details, paid closer attention to timelines. Not obsessively, not yet, but intentionally. The shift felt uncomfortable, like crossing an invisible line. For years, trust had been automatic. Now, observation required effort, and effort changes things, even before you know whether your concerns are justified. The strange part is that I still didn't think I was approaching certainty. If anything, the additional details created more confusion. Some evidence seemed concerning, other evidence seemed reassuring. The overall picture remained incomplete. But one fact was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The inconsistencies weren't isolated anymore. They were beginning to form a pattern. Not a clear pattern, not a definitive one, just enough of a pattern that I could no longer convince myself everything existed only in my imagination. And once that happened, I found myself revisiting a particular month over and over again, because several details from that period suddenly appeared connected in a way I hadn't seen before. The connection wasn't dramatic. It didn't reveal the truth, but it changed the way I understood everything that came after. What unsettled me most wasn't discovering a new fact. It was realizing that facts I'd already known for months seemed different when placed beside each other in the right order. I wish I could point to a single moment, a text message, a photograph, a confession, something clean and undeniable. People like stories that work that way because certainty creates structure. There's a before, there's an after, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. My experience wasn't like that. The truth arrived gradually. Or maybe the facts arrived gradually and the truth was something I assembled afterward. I'm still not entirely sure. What I do know is that there was one weekend when several unrelated details finally settled into place. Not dramatically, almost quietly, the way a blurry image slowly comes into focus. It started with an old calendar entry I had already looked through previous months once before. At the time, I'd noticed a few scheduling inconsistencies and then tried to forget about them. But once you've noticed something, it becomes difficult not to revisit it. So one Saturday morning, while my wife was out running errands, I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and started reconstructing timelines. Not because I wanted to catch her. Not because I had become some obsessive investigator. Honestly, I was trying to prove myself wrong. I wanted the pieces to fit. I wanted all the uncertainty of the previous year to resolve into a perfectly ordinary explanation. Instead, something else happened. I found a sequence of dates that didn't align. Again, not dramatically, just enough. A work event that seemed to last longer than originally described. A day she'd supposedly been at the office during hours when nobody from her department appeared to be working. A weekend obligation that seemed to overlap with another explanation she'd given weeks earlier. Individually, none of it mattered. Together, it created a problem. Not because it proved anything, because I could no longer make the timeline work. For months, I had been treating every inconsistency separately. This date, that conversation, a forgotten detail, a confusing explanation. Viewed individually, each one was harmless. Viewed collectively, they began telling a different story. Or at least suggesting one. I remember sitting there for nearly an hour staring at the calendar, not moving, not thinking clearly, just looking. The feeling wasn't shock, it was recognition, like finally understanding a sentence you've been reading incorrectly. The words hadn't changed, your interpretation had, and once the correct interpretation appears, the old one becomes impossible to recover. That afternoon, I found myself remembering dozens of conversations differently, not because the content changed, because the context changed. The work dinners, the late meetings, the repeated references to Daniel, the emotional distance, the disappearing routines. For the first time, they seemed connected. A pattern emerged where previously there had only been fragments. And that's when something happened that I still struggle to explain. I stopped searching for explanations. Not completely, but mostly. For months, I'd been working desperately to preserve uncertainty. I'd defended every inconsistency, questioned every concern, argued against my own observations. Suddenly, I felt tired, not angry, not devastated, just tired. The effort of maintaining doubt had become exhausting. That evening, my wife came home carrying groceries. I helped unload them. We discussed dinner. We watched television. Everything looked normal. And yet something fundamental had changed. Not in her. In me. For the first time, I genuinely believed there was a possibility that my marriage was not what I thought it was. The belief wasn't certainty, but it was close enough to alter reality. A few days later, another piece fell into place. Completely by accident. My wife mentioned an event from several months earlier. A routine conversation. A casual reference. Something she'd probably forgotten 5 minutes later. The problem was that I remembered the date, because I'd spent so much time reviewing timelines, and her description didn't fit. Not approximately, not loosely. It simply didn't fit. I didn't challenge her. I nodded and moved on. But afterward I checked. The records were still there. Calendar entries, messages, appointment confirmations. Nothing dramatic, nothing private, just ordinary documentation of ordinary life. And for the first time, I encountered an inconsistency that couldn't be explained by memory alone. One version of events was wrong. Maybe hers, maybe mine, but not both. I sat with that realization for several days. The emotional response surprised me. I expected panic. Instead, I felt numb. Not because the situation was less painful than I imagined, because the pain had already been arriving in small pieces for months. There was no single impact, only accumulation. That's what people rarely describe. By the time certainty begins to form, you've often already processed much of the grief, not consciously, but gradually. Through hundreds of moments of confusion, through repeated disappointments, through the slow erosion of trust. One evening I called my brother. We talked about nothing important for a while. Sports, work, family. Then I told him I thought something might be seriously wrong. Not that I knew, not that I could prove, just that I thought. There was a long pause. Finally, he asked the same question he'd asked months earlier. Have you talked to her? I said no. And then, the answer sounded ridiculous even to me, because by then I knew the conversation was inevitable. I was postponing it because I already understood something uncomfortable. No answer she gave could restore the version of reality I'd been living in, even if there was an innocent explanation, even if every inconsistency somehow resolved itself. The trust I'd once experienced automatically was already damaged, not destroyed. And damage changes things. The next few days felt strangely calm. I went to work, paid bills, mowed the lawn, cooked dinner, performed all the ordinary tasks of ordinary life. Meanwhile, a different life seemed to be ending quietly beneath the surface. No explosions, no revelations, just a growing awareness that the story I'd been telling myself no longer made sense. I think that's when realization truly arrived. Not when I found evidence, not when I connected timelines, when I finally stopped fighting the possibility itself. Because once I allowed that possibility to exist, too many previous months suddenly became understandable, not proven, understandable. And understanding can be almost as painful as certainty, especially when it transforms memories that once felt safe. The conversation I had avoided for so long was approaching. I knew it. She probably knew something was different too, though we never discussed it. What I didn't know was whether I wanted answers anymore. After months of uncertainty, I wasn't sure answers would help, but silence wasn't helping either. And eventually you reach a point where living between those two things becomes impossible. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't planned. There was no dramatic discovery beforehand. Just an ordinary evening when continuing to pretend felt more exhausting than asking the question. The conversation happened on a Wednesday evening. I remember that because Wednesdays had always been uneventful for us. Nothing scheduled, nothing social, just the middle of the week. The kind of day people forget almost immediately. In some ways, that feels appropriate. Even the confrontation arrived wrapped in ordinary life. We had eaten dinner, the dishes were done, the television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. Outside, it had started raining, the kind of steady rain that turns the windows into mirrors after dark. For nearly an hour, we sat in silence. Not awkward silence, familiar silence, the sort that develops naturally after years together. Then I muted the television. That was it. That was the dramatic beginning. Not shouting, not accusations, just pressing a button on a remote. My wife looked over. What is it? Even then, I almost backed out. I can still remember the feeling, the desire to postpone everything one more day, one more week, one more month. Because uncertainty is painful, but certainty carries consequences. Once certain conversations begin, they cannot be undone. I stared at the blank television screen for several seconds. Then I asked the simplest question I could think of. Are we okay? The moment felt strangely small, almost disappointing. After everything I'd spent months thinking about, that was what came out. Not are you cheating? Not who's Daniel? Just are we okay? She didn't answer immediately. The pause wasn't dramatic, just long enough to notice. Then she asked what I meant. I remember laughing quietly, not because anything was funny, because I genuinely didn't know how to answer. What did I mean? Did I mean the distance? The inconsistencies? The uncertainty? The months of conversations that felt incomplete? The growing suspicion I hadn't wanted to admit even to myself? Eventually, I settled on the truth, or part of it. I feel like we've been drifting apart. She looked down, then back at me, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of us rushed to fill the silence. The conversation that followed wasn't explosive. If anything, it was frustratingly calm. She acknowledged the distance. She acknowledged being distracted. She acknowledged feeling disconnected at times. None of that surprised me. I'd expected it. What surprised me was how little clarity those admissions provided. Every answer seemed to create new questions. Not because she was evasive exactly, more because everything remained vague, general, difficult to pin down. Work stress, burnout, feeling overwhelmed. The kinds of explanations that are both believable and impossible to verify. At some point, I asked whether there was someone else. The words came out more quietly than I'd imagined, almost casually, as if I were asking about whether. I still remember her face, not because she looked guilty, because she looked tired, very tired. The expression stayed with me afterward. There was a long pause. Then she said no. Just one word. No anger, no outrage, no immediate defensiveness. Simply no. For a moment, I felt relieved, then confused by my own relief. Because if the answers settled things, why didn't I feel settled? The conversation continued, slowly, carefully, like two people walking across thin ice. Eventually, I mentioned Daniel, not accusingly, just directly. Her reaction was subtle, so subtle that if I'd been watching casually, I might have missed it. A slight hesitation, a brief shift in expression, then another explanation. Coworker, project partner, someone she'd spent considerable time with because of work responsibilities. Everything sounded plausible, reasonable, maybe even true, yet something felt incomplete. I couldn't identify exactly what, only that I was listening differently now, not searching for contradictions, searching for certainty, and certainty never arrived. At one point I asked a question about a specific timeline, one of the inconsistencies I'd been unable to reconcile. She became quiet. Then she said she didn't remember. Again, entirely possible. I barely remembered it myself. Months had passed. Most people don't retain precise records of ordinary days. Still, the answer lingered, because it appeared repeatedly. I don't remember. I don't know. Maybe. Those responses filled the spaces where clarity might have existed. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, I had learned very little. Or perhaps I'd learned more than I realized. Not through information, for absence. What struck me most wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. There was no strong denial beyond the initial one. No passionate defense of the marriage. No visible surprise at the concerns I'd raised. Mostly there was fatigue. Fatigue from both of us. Years of routine. Months of distance. Conversations postponed too long. Eventually, the discussion simply ended, not resolved. And that we were exhausted. There wasn't anywhere else for it to go. She went upstairs first. I remained in the living room. The rain was still falling outside. The television remained dark. For a long time, I sat there alone, trying to decide whether the conversation had changed anything. The answer was complicated. Objectively, I still lacked certainty. No confession, no undeniable proof, no dramatic revelation. Yet something inside me had shifted again, because I realized I had stopped evaluating individual facts. Instead, I was evaluating the overall shape of reality, and the shape no longer looked familiar. The next few days were strangely polite, almost gentle. Neither of us referenced the conversation directly. We continued functioning, working, cooking, cleaning, existing together. But there was a new awareness between us, a recognition that something important had finally been spoken aloud, not resolved, acknowledged. And sometimes acknowledgement changes a relationship more than answers do. One evening, about a week later, I found myself reviewing everything again. The timelines, the conversations, the explanations, the months of uncertainty. For the first time, I wasn't trying to determine whether betrayal had occurred. I was trying to determine whether trust still existed. Those turned out to be different questions, and the answer to the second one frightened me more than the first. Because even without certainty, I already knew something had been lost. Something neither of us seemed capable of rebuilding through conversation alone. What happened afterward wasn't a dramatic separation or a final revelation. It was something slower and, in many ways, harder. Learning how to live with a reality that had become clear enough to hurt, but never clear enough to fully explain. For a long time after that conversation, nothing changed. At least not externally. That's probably the hardest part to explain to people. They imagine confrontation as a turning point, a dividing line, one life before, another life after. But most of the changes happened inside me, where nobody could see them. The house looked the same. The routines continued. We still woke up at similar times, still discussed groceries, still paid bills, still sat across from each other at dinner. From a distance, our marriage remained recognizable, only I no longer experienced it the same way. Before, uncertainty had occupied most of my mental energy. I was constantly evaluating possibilities, questioning memories, searching for explanations. After the conversation, that process began slowing down. Not because I received answers, because I stopped believing answers were coming. That realization brought an unexpected kind of peace. Not happiness, certainly not relief, just an end to the endless analysis. For months, I'd been trying to solve something. Now I was simply living with it. I remember one Saturday morning in particular. My wife was reading at the kitchen table. I was drinking coffee. Sunlight was coming through the windows. Everything looked completely ordinary. A year earlier, I would have described the scene as comfortable, familiar, domestic. Now it felt different. Not hostile, not tense, just distant, like sitting beside someone through a pane of glass. You can still see them, you can still communicate, but something separates you. The strange thing was that I wasn't angry. People often assume betrayal creates immediate rage. Maybe for some people it does. For me, the dominant emotion was exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that develops after carrying uncertainty for too long. By then I had spent months revisiting conversations, months reconsidering memories, months trying to determine where reality ended and interpretation began. Eventually you run out of energy. At some point acceptance arrives simply because maintaining resistance becomes too difficult. Around this time, I noticed that I had stopped asking certain questions. Not consciously, the questions just disappeared. I no longer asked detailed follow-ups about her workday. I no longer tried to reconstruct schedules. I no longer paid close attention to timelines. The detective work, if it can even be called, that ended. Not because I'd solved the mystery, because I no longer needed to. Deep down, I already knew enough. Not enough for a courtroom, not enough for absolute certainty, enough for myself. There's a difference. One evening my brother called. We hadn't spoken in a few weeks. At some point he asked how things were going. I remember staring out the living room window before answering. Finally, I said something like, "I think I know what happened. I just don't think I'll ever know all of it." There was a long silence. Then he said, "Maybe that's all anyone ever gets." At the time I didn't respond, but later I realized he was probably right. Most endings don't come with complete explanations. People don't provide detailed reports of their emotional lives. Relationships don't generate neat summaries. You get fragments. You build a story from those fragments. Then you live with whatever uncertainty remains. The emotional distance between my wife and me became easier to acknowledge after that, not because it increased, because I stopped pretending it wasn't there. We were polite, kind, even. There were no screaming matches, no accusations, no dramatic confrontations. In some ways that made everything sadder. If we'd hated each other, the situation would have felt simpler. Hatred creates momentum. We didn't hate each other. We were just standing in the ruins of something neither of us seemed capable of repairing. One night I found an old photo album while cleaning a closet. Vacation pictures, family gatherings, ordinary moments from earlier years. I sat on the floor flipping through pages for almost an hour. What surprised me wasn't sadness. It was how real those memories still felt. People often rewrite the past after betrayal. They decide everything was fake. Every smile was a lie. Every good memory becomes contaminated. I couldn't do that. The photographs looked genuine because they were genuine. Those years happened. The affection happened. The life we built happened. Whatever came later didn't erase that. It simply existed alongside it. That realization helped me more than anything else, because it allowed me to stop treating the entire marriage as a deception. Something valuable had existed. It just wasn't enough to survive whatever happened afterward. As the weeks passed, I gradually accepted another uncomfortable truth. The relationship itself had become secondary. The larger issue was trust. And trust, once damaged, behaves differently than love. Love can survive uncertainty. Trust struggles to. Every conversation became filtered through questions I couldn't fully answer. Every explanation contained echoes of previous inconsistencies. Even ordinary interactions felt slightly altered. Not dramatically, just enough. I began imagining a future that didn't include the marriage. Not actively planning, just imagining. What would life look like? Where would I live? How would daily routines change? At first, those thoughts felt disloyal. Then they started feeling practical. Eventually, they felt inevitable. I didn't arrive at that conclusion through anger. I arrived through repetition, through hundreds of small moments that gradually revealed the same reality. The marriage I thought I had no longer existed. Maybe it hadn't existed for quite some time. The final stage wasn't grief exactly. It was recognition. Recognition that some losses occur long before they're officially acknowledged. Recognition that certainty isn't always necessary. Recognition that emotional acceptance often arrives before factual closure. By the time I reached that point, the need for definitive proof had almost disappeared. Not because proof didn't matter, because my life could no longer remain suspended while waiting for it. Eventually, a person has to choose a direction, even if some questions remain unanswered, especially if they do. And once I accepted that, I found myself preparing for something I had spent years believing would never happen. Not revenge, not confrontation, not even closure, just separation from the life I had assumed was permanent. The aftermath turned out to be far less dramatic than I expected. No single event ended the marriage. Instead, it unraveled the same way it had changed slowly, quietly, and one ordinary day at a time. The marriage didn't end with a dramatic conversation. There was no final revelation, no secret phone discovered in the middle of the night, no confession delivered through tears, no moment where everything suddenly became clear. Instead, it ended the way most of our life had been lived, quietly, gradually, almost politely. People sometimes ask whether we officially separated after another argument or another discovery. The answer is no, at least not in the way people usually mean. What happened was simpler, and somehow sadder. Over the following months, the gap between us stopped being something we discussed and became something we lived inside. The distance that once felt temporary started feeling permanent. Not because either of us announced it, because neither of us seemed capable of crossing it anymore. We still shared a house, still shared responsibilities, still coordinated schedules, but increasingly, our lives resembled parallel lines rather than a partnership. I remember noticing how often entire evenings passed without meaningful conversation, not hostile silence, just absence. Two people occupying the same space while existing in different emotional worlds. Eventually, practical discussions began appearing, at first indirectly. Financial questions, housing questions, conversations about the future that avoided naming the future directly. Then gradually, the language became more explicit. The word separation entered the discussion almost casually, not during an argument, during a logistical conversation, as though we were discussing a repair project. I think that's what surprised me most, how ordinary it sounded. By then, so much emotional work had already occurred privately that the practical decisions felt almost administrative. The grief had arrived earlier. The paperwork came later. The months that followed were strange. Not because of conflict, because of routine. People underestimate how much of marriage consists of tiny habits, shared assumptions, invisible cooperation. The first time I bought groceries only for myself felt strange. The first time I came home and realized nobody else would arrive later felt strange. The first time I got sick and instinctively reached for my phone before remembering things had changed felt strange. Loss rarely announces itself dramatically. Most of the time it appears through interruptions to routine. A missing coffee mug, an empty chair, a silence where a familiar voice used to be. Those were the moments that affected me most. Not the legal process, not the logistics, the ordinary absences. For a while, I kept expecting clarity to arrive. I thought that once the marriage officially ended, everything would finally make sense. It didn't. The unanswered questions remained unanswered. What exactly happened? When did it start? How much of what I suspected was accurate? How much was incomplete? I never received definitive answers, and eventually I stopped expecting them. That was harder than I anticipated. People talk a lot about forgiveness, very little about uncertainty. Forgiveness at least has an object. You know what you're forgiving. Uncertainty lingers differently. It leaves empty spaces, gaps in the story, places where certainty should exist but doesn't. Learning to live with those gaps became part of recovery. Not because I wanted to, because there was no alternative. A year after the separation, I found myself driving through a part of town where my wife and I used to shop regularly. Without thinking, I almost turned into a parking lot we'd visited hundreds of times. The realization hit me halfway through the turn. Not sadness exactly, more like recognition, a reminder of how deeply routines embed themselves into a life. I parked anyway, sat for a few minutes, then left. That moment stayed with me, not because it was emotional, because it wasn't. The intensity had faded by then. What remained was something quieter, acceptance. The life we built together had become part of my history rather than my present. That distinction took a long time to fully understand. Friends occasionally asked whether I ever learned the whole truth. My answer eventually became simple. No, then I'd usually leave it there. Because the truth is that the whole truth is often a myth. Even people directly involved in a relationship rarely understand every reason things happen. Human beings are messy narrators of their own lives. We simplify, we justify, we forget, we revise. Expecting a complete explanation became less important over time. What mattered more was understanding my own experience. And my experience was this. For years, I lived inside a marriage that felt ordinary. Then subtle changes appeared. Then uncertainty. Then doubt. Then realization. Not through dramatic discoveries. Through accumulation. Through patterns. Through the gradual recognition that reality no longer matched the story I had been telling myself. Looking back now, I don't think the affair, if that's even the correct word for everything that happened, was the most painful part. The most painful part was losing confidence in my own perception, spending months unsure whether I was imagining problems or noticing them, questioning memories, questioning instincts, questioning reality. That uncertainty changed me more than the eventual separation did. It taught me how fragile certainty can be, how slowly trust can erode, how difficult it is to recognize change while you're living through it. Most importantly, it taught me something I resisted for a long time. Closure isn't always available. Sometimes facts become clear while emotions remain unresolved. Sometimes you understand enough to move forward without understanding everything. Sometimes acceptance arrives not because your questions were answered, but because you're tired of carrying them. Today, my life is quieter, smaller in some ways, simpler in others. I have new routines now, different habits, different expectations. The old life feels both distant and strangely close, like something that happened to another version of me. I don't hate my ex-wife. I don't spend much time wondering what she's doing, and I don't replay timelines anymore. That chapter finally became too heavy to keep carrying. What remains are fragments. Coffee on a Sunday morning, a grocery cart moving down familiar aisles, a television playing in the background while two people sit on the same couch. Ordinary memories from an ordinary marriage. Some painful, some warm, most of them both. And maybe that's the most honest ending I can offer. Not certainty, not revenge, not closure, Just the understanding that a life can fall apart quietly, that betrayal can reveal itself slowly, and that sometimes survival looks less like overcoming something and more like learning how to keep walking after you accepted that some questions will follow you forever. That's all. I don't know if writing it helped, but for the first time in a long while, the story exists outside my head. This is the end of the story. Don't forget to share with your friends, comment, like, and subscribe.